November 3rd, 1943. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands, Aero 542 hours. The jungle breathed with 1,000 invisible threats. Private James Caldwell crouched in the root hollow of a banyan tree, his Springfield M1903 rifle pressed against his shoulder, the wood grain smooth beneath his calloused fingers. Around him the morning mist clung to the undergrowth like wet wool, and somewhere in the canopy above, a bird called out, sharp, insistent, too regular to be natural. He had learned in his 8 days on this island that nothing was as it seemed, that the jungle itself was an enemy as implacable as the Japanese soldiers who moved through it like ghosts. His breath came slow and measured, the way his father had taught him when hunting white-tailed deer in the hills of Kentucky, when patience meant the difference between meat for winter and an empty smokehouse. 300 yards distant, through a narrow corridor of vegetation that opened for perhaps 6 inches between 2 moss-covered tree trunks, Caldwell could see the ridge where his platoon had lost 2 men the previous day. Both had been killed by a single shot each, precision fire from a position no one could identify, a sniper who understood the jungle's geometry better than any Marine in the company. The first man had been shot through the temple while eating his morning rations. The second had died reaching for his canteen, the bullet entering beneath his helmet rim, instant and clinical. The Japanese sniper had not fired again, had simply vanished into the green maze, leaving only corpses and the growing certainty among Caldwell's unit that someone out there possessed skills that exceeded their own. Caldwell's platoon sergeant, a pre-war regular named Kowalski, who had fought on Guadalcanal, had approached him the previous evening with a proposition that felt more like a test. "You're the farm boy who claims he can shoot, right? The one from hillbilly country who bragged at Camp Lejeune about killing squirrels at 100 yards? The words had been delivered with the casual contempt career Marines reserved for new replacements, for teenagers who arrived fresh from training with no concept of what combat actually meant. Caldwell had not bragged. He had simply answered honestly when asked about his shooting experience, but honesty among strangers became boasting in the retelling, and now he carried a reputation he had never sought. "I can shoot," Caldwell had replied quietly, meeting Kowalski's eyes in the gathering darkness. "My daddy taught me. We ate what I killed, so I learned not to miss." The sergeant had studied him for a long moment, weighing the 18-year-old replacement who looked even younger than his age, who spoke with an Appalachian drawl that made him sound slow to men who mistook accent for intelligence. "Then you're going to get a chance to prove it," Kowalski had said finally, "because that Jap sniper is going to kill more of my men, and I'm tired of losing Marines to an enemy I can't see. You're going to find him, and you're going to kill him. And if you can't do that, farm boy, then at least you'll draw his fire and maybe we'll spot his position when he shoots you." The proposition was not altruistic. Kowalski was simply making the calculation every infantry leader made, trading the uncertain potential of a replacement for information that might save veterans, sacrificing the new to protect the experienced. Caldwell understood this without resentment. The logic was sound, even if it meant his life was valued less than the intelligence his death might provide. He had accepted the assignment, had spent the night checking his rifle and thinking about the skills his father had imparted during a childhood spent hunting in terrain, not unlike this jungle, where patience and observation mattered more than quick shooting, where understanding animal behavior meant the difference between success and hunger. His father had been a subsistence farmer in the Cumberland Mountains, scratching out a living from rocky soil that yielded more stones than crops, supplementing their meager harvest with wild game that Caldwell learned to hunt almost before he could read. Squirrels, rabbits, deer, turkey. His father had taught him to read sign, to move silently through forests, to understand that hunting was not about shooting, but about becoming invisible, about seeing without being seen, about patience that bordered on meditation. "The animal knows the woods better than you ever will," his father had said again and again, sitting on their porch while cleaning rifles that were tools rather than toys, maintained with the care city people reserved for automobiles. So you don't try to outthink it. You become part of the woods. You wait until the animal forgets you're there. And then you take your shot, clean and quick, because anything else is cruelty and waste. Those lessons learned in poverty and necessity had seemed irrelevant at Camp Lejeune, where drill instructors emphasized volume of fire and aggressive assault, where marksmanship training involved shooting at static targets from known distances, where the entire philosophy of Marine Corps infantry tactics centered on closing with the enemy and destroying him through superior firepower and ferocity. Caldwell had qualified as an expert rifleman, but so had many others, and the skill seemed less important than the ability to follow orders, maintain equipment, and endure the bureaucratic tedium that comprised most military life. The other Marines in his training platoon had mocked his rural background, had laughed at his accent and his stories of hunting for survival, had treated his genuine skill with rifles as a curiosity rather than an asset. "Farm boy thinks he's Annie Oakley," one Marine had said during a conversation about shooting. "Probably never seen a real firefight. Thinks combat is like shooting possums off a fence post." The laughter had been good-natured, but dismissive, the urban superiority of men from Chicago and Detroit and New York, who saw rural America as backward, whose own experiences with weapons came from shooting galleries and military training rather than necessity. Caldwell had said nothing, had learned early that defending himself only invited more mockery, that silence was easier than trying to explain a world these men had never experienced. But now, crouched in the pre-dawn darkness of a Pacific Island jungle, those half-forgotten skills returned with the clarity of muscle memory. Caldwell watched the ridge through his rifle's aperture sight, studying not the obvious firing positions but the spaces between, the subtle irregularities in vegetation patterns, the places where human presence might reveal itself through absence rather than action. His father had taught him to look for what didn't belong, the branch that bent wrong, the leaves that showed their undersides in still air, the shadow that didn't match the light. Japanese snipers were masters of camouflage, could transform themselves into trees or bushes so effectively that Marines walked past them without noticing. But camouflage required stillness, and stillness over hours meant small movements, adjustments that created micro-changes in the visual field. An hour passed, then another. The mist burned off as the sun climbed, revealing a landscape of impossible green, everything dripping with moisture, alive with insects and the distant sounds of birds, and the occasional crack of rifle fire from other sectors where men were dying in anonymous violence. Caldwell's legs cramped, his shoulders ached, sweat soaked his uniform, and mosquitoes found the exposed skin at his collar and wrists, biting with impunity because movement to swat them might reveal his position. He ignored all of it, maintained his focus on the ridge, on the specific sight lines that would offer a sniper both visibility and concealment. And then he saw it, not the sniper himself, but the absence that marked human presence. A section of vegetation, perhaps 12 inches wide, that moved slightly wrong, swaying when no wind blew, the motion too regular and isolated. Caldwell watched it for another 30 minutes, confirming the pattern, noting that the movement occurred every 8 to 10 minutes, as if someone were shifting weight or adjusting position. He calculated the distance at approximately 340 yards, a long shot made longer by humidity that would affect bullet trajectory, by vegetation that might deflect his round, by the fact that his target was still invisible and might not even exist, might be a phantom created by his imagination and the desperate need to find something, anything, to justify this vigil. But his father's voice spoke in his memory. Trust what you see, not what you hope to see. The movement was real. Something human was in that position, concealed so effectively that Caldwell could identify location but not form, could sense presence without confirming target. He would have to shoot blind, would have to aim at vegetation and hope that behind it lay a Japanese sniper rather than a swaying branch or a monkey or nothing at all. The risk was real. Firing would reveal his position to every enemy within 500 yards, would mark him as a threat requiring elimination. If he missed, if his target was imaginary or his shot ineffective, he would draw fire from multiple directions with no second chance. Caldwell thought about his father, about winter mornings in Kentucky when food depended on accuracy, when a missed shot meant the deer spooked and disappeared and the family ate beans instead of venison. He thought about the 2 dead Marines on that ridge, about the sergeant's contempt and the platoon's dismissive laughter, about the fact that his life had been measured and found worth less than the information his death might provide. He thought about all of this in the space of 3 heartbeats, and then he stopped thinking and began the sequence his body knew without conscious direction. Breath control first. 3 deep breaths, then exhale half of the 4th and hold. Sight picture next. The aperture rear sight aligned with the front post, both centered on the section of vegetation that moved wrong, adjusted slightly upward to compensate for bullet drop at range. Trigger control last. The Springfield's trigger was heavier than ideal, required steady pressure rather than a quick pull, and Caldwell increased pressure gradually, smoothly, letting the rifle fire itself rather than jerking the shot. The Springfield's report shattered the jungle silence, and for an instant Caldwell saw nothing except the vegetation shaking from his bullet's passage. Then, 340 yards distant, a figure materialized as if conjured from the foliage itself. A Japanese soldier tumbling forward from a platform concealed in the tree canopy, rifle falling separately, body already limp in death before it struck the ground 20 feet below. The camouflage that had made him invisible dissolved in motion, revealing the reality Caldwell had intuited rather than seen, confirming that his shot had found its target through pure instinct and skills learned feeding his family in the Depression-era South. For a moment, the jungle held its breath. Then the air came alive with rifle fire, Japanese positions that had been invisible suddenly revealing themselves as they fired at where Caldwell's muzzle flash had appeared. But Caldwell was already moving, already sliding backward through the undergrowth, using vegetation for concealment the way his father had taught him deer hunting. Never running, but flowing, minimizing profile and noise. Bullets snapped through the space he had occupied, but by then he was 30 yards distant, circling toward his own lines through routes he had memorized during the night, moving with the patience of a man who understood that survival depended on never hurrying, never panicking. He reached Marine lines 20 minutes later, emerging from the jungle to find Sergeant Kowalski waiting with an expression that had shifted from contempt to grudging reassessment. "The Jap fell out of a tree," Kowalski said without preamble. "We saw him drop. You actually hit something you couldn't see, from 300 yards plus, through jungle vegetation. How the hell did you do that?" Caldwell unslung his rifle, checked it automatically for damage, didn't meet the sergeant's eyes. "My daddy taught me to hunt," he said quietly. "You learn to see what's hidden, or you go hungry. That's all." But it wasn't all, and both men knew it. Caldwell had demonstrated a skill set that was rare in infantry combat, a combination of patience, observation, and marksmanship that made him far more valuable than a standard rifleman. Over the following week, as the Marines expanded their perimeter on Bougainville, Caldwell was tasked with eliminating Japanese snipers, the invisible killers who inflicted casualties disproportionate to their numbers, who demoralized units and slowed advances, who represented a persistent threat that conventional infantry tactics could not address effectively. He killed a second sniper on November 4th, a man concealed in a spider hole who had been shooting Marines attempting to fill canteens at a creek. Caldwell had studied the shooting angles, identified the limited positions that offered line of sight to the creek, then simply waited in concealment for 14 hours until the Japanese sniper revealed himself by firing at a Marine who had been sent deliberately into the kill zone as bait. Caldwell's return shot was fired less than 2 seconds after the Japanese rifle report, dropping the sniper before he could chamber another round. The Marine who had served as bait, a corporal named Henderson who had volunteered knowing the risk, later bought Caldwell a drink from his medicinal brandy ration. "You country boys know something about fighting we city folks forgot," Henderson said, his hand still shaking from the experience of being used as live bait. "My grandfather fought in the trenches in France, said the farm boys made the best soldiers because they understood killing without hating. You proved him right today." The third and fourth snipers died on November 6th, both killed within an hour of each other from positions separated by half a mile of jungle. Caldwell had identified their locations by analyzing shooting incidents over the previous 3 days, mapping where Marines had been hit and reverse engineering likely sniper positions. The first he killed at 420 yards, a shot that required him to aim 2 feet above his target to compensate for bullet drop. The second died at closer range, only 200 yards, but the shot was complicated by vegetation that forced Caldwell to fire through a gap no larger than his fist, threading the bullet between obstacles that would have deflected a less precise round. By then, Caldwell's reputation had spread through the battalion. The farm boy who had been mocked for his accent and his rural background had become something approaching legendary. The replacement who killed Japanese snipers with a consistency that defied probability. Marines began treating him differently, not with open respect, which would have been too much to expect from men who hoarded status like currency, but with a wary acknowledgement that he possessed skills they lacked, that his rural poverty had forged capabilities their urban upbringings had never required. But respect carried its own burdens. Caldwell found himself increasingly isolated, separated from normal infantry duties and employed exclusively as a counter-sniper, sent into the jungle alone or with a single spotter to hunt men who were themselves hunters, to engage in a form of combat that was intensely personal and utterly solitary. While his platoon fought conventional battles, assaulting bunkers and clearing positions, Caldwell stalked through the undergrowth like his father had stalked deer, waiting in stillness for hours or days until his targets revealed themselves through the smallest error, the slightest lapse in discipline. The fifth sniper fell on November 8th, killed at dawn from a position Caldwell had occupied since the previous afternoon. He had identified the likely hide by studying terrain and calculating where a sniper would position himself to cover a trail the Marines used for patrols. Then he had simply moved into a concealed position with direct line of sight to that hide and waited, motionless, through the night, through the dawn, until the Japanese sniper arrived to begin his own watch. The man never knew he was being hunted. Died without warning, Caldwell's bullet arriving before the sound of the shot, killing instantly and efficiently the way good hunters killed, minimizing suffering because cruelty served no purpose. The sixth and seventh snipers died on November 10th, the final kills of Caldwell's 8-day counter-sniper operation. Both were eliminated from extreme range, the sixth at 480 yards, the seventh at an estimated 530 yards, distances at which the Springfield's accuracy became more theoretical than practical, where wind and humidity and the inherent limitations of iron sights made hitting a man-sized target as much fortune as skill. But Caldwell's childhood had been spent making improbable shots because his family needed meat, and he had learned to read wind by watching leaves to compensate for humidity by adjusting his sight picture, to account for all the variables that turned long-range shooting from science into art. The seventh Japanese sniper, the final kill, had been positioned in a tree at the edge of a clearing where Marines were constructing a supply dump. He had killed 3 men over 2 days, always firing once and then vanishing, never remaining in position long enough for counterfire to be effective. Caldwell had predicted his location not through any supernatural insight but through simple logic. There were only so many positions that offered the required sight lines while maintaining concealment, and Caldwell had systematically eliminated the unlikely options until only one remained. He had moved into position before dawn, had waited 7 hours for the Japanese sniper to arrive, and had taken his shot the moment the target revealed himself by assuming his firing position. 7 snipers eliminated in 8 days. The number seemed almost impossible, a tally that belonged in propaganda rather than reality. But it was real, documented in after-action reports and confirmed by officers who witnessed the results even if they never understood the process. Caldwell's achievement was not superhuman accuracy or preternatural skill. He missed shots, made errors in judgment, survived as much through luck as through competence. But he brought to combat a skill set learned in poverty and necessity, applied hunting techniques developed for feeding his family to the business of killing enemy soldiers, and discovered that the principles were identical even if the targets differed. The irony was not lost on Caldwell. The Marines who had mocked his rural background, who had treated his accent and his upbringing as markers of inferiority, now depended on skills that could only have been developed in exactly the environment they disdained. The poverty that had defined his childhood, the subsistence hunting, the necessity of perfect shots because ammunition was expensive and meat was survival, had forged capabilities that urban recruits could never replicate. The city boys had fired thousands of rounds in training, had learned marksmanship from instructors who taught standardized techniques, but they had never learned patience, had never developed the ability to become invisible and wait, had never understood that hunting was 99% observation and 1% shooting. This was not a matter of rural superiority or urban inadequacy. It was simply the recognition that different environments cultivated different capabilities, that skills learned for one purpose could be adapted to another, that the military's standardized training could not replicate the education Caldwell had received from his father in the hills of Kentucky. The Marines could teach men to shoot accurately at known distances. They could not teach the intuition that came from years of hunting, the ability to read terrain and predict behavior, the comfort with solitude and silence that made extended stalking psychologically tolerable. After the 7th kill, Caldwell was pulled from counter-sniper operations. The battalion commander, a colonel who had graduated from Annapolis and viewed warfare through the lens of tactics manuals, had expressed concern that relying on a single rifleman was strategically unsound, that Caldwell's death or injury would leave the unit without counter-sniper capability. The logic was reasonable, though it ignored the obvious reality that no other Marine in the battalion possessed comparable skills, that training could not manufacture in weeks what Caldwell had learned over years. He was reassigned to normal infantry duties, returned to his platoon, and found himself treated with a peculiar mixture of respect and isolation, as if his success had marked him as different, as if killing 7 enemy snipers had somehow separated him from the ordinary violence of infantry combat. The 8 days on Bougainville defined Caldwell in ways he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He had proven himself to men who doubted him, had validated skills they dismissed, had demonstrated that the rural poverty they mocked had forged something valuable and rare. But he had also learned that combat revealed people in their essence, stripped away the social performances and exposed the raw capabilities beneath. The Marines who had seemed impressive in training, confident, articulate, physically imposing, often proved less effective in combat than quiet men from farms and small towns, men who understood patience and observation, who were comfortable with discomfort, who had grown up with violence in the form of slaughtering livestock and hunting game. Caldwell survived Bougainville and the subsequent campaigns. He fought on Guam and Peleliu, served through to the war's end, and returned home to Kentucky in 1946, 21 years old and aged beyond his years by experiences that could not be adequately explained to people who had not shared them. He resumed farming, married his childhood sweetheart, raised children who never knew hunger the way he had known it, who grew up in a post-war prosperity that his generation had secured through blood and would never fully enjoy themselves. He spoke rarely about the war, and when he did, he focused on the ordinary experiences, the boredom, the miserable food, the friendships formed and broken by death. He never mentioned the 7 snipers, never spoke about the 8 days when his childhood skills had made him valuable to men who had previously treated him with contempt. That part of his life remained private, locked away with other memories too complex to share, too laden with emotions that had no easy resolution. But he taught his sons to hunt, passed down the skills his own father had imparted, showed them how to read sign and move silently, and wait with patience that bordered on meditation. And sometimes, when they returned from successful hunts with deer or turkey, when they cleaned their kills with the efficiency that minimized waste and honored the animal's death, Caldwell would feel a distant echo of those 8 days on Bougainville, would remember being 18 and afraid, and discovering that the poverty he had resented had gifted him with skills that saved his life and the lives of men who had mocked him. Epilogue: The Inheritance of Necessity. The Springfield M1903 that James Caldwell carried on Bougainville now hangs above a fireplace in Kentucky, maintained by his grandson with the same care Caldwell himself learned from his father. It is a relic of another era, superseded by technologies that would seem magical to the men who used it. A bolt-action rifle in a world of semi-automatic precision and electronic sighting. But to those who understand its history, who know the story of the farm boy who killed 7 Japanese snipers in 8 days, the rifle represents something more than obsolete technology. It symbolizes the skills learned in poverty and applied in war, the capabilities forged by necessity rather than choice. The inheritance passed from father to son through generations who hunted not for sport, but for survival. Caldwell's accuracy was not natural talent, but learned expertise, developed through years of practice motivated by hunger, refined through repetition that could not be replicated in any training program. His success as a counter-sniper reflected not individual superiority, but the accumulated wisdom of rural America, the understanding of weapons and terrain and patience that came from living close to the land, from depending on personal skill rather than institutional support. The Marines who mocked his accent and his background had learned to shoot in training programs designed by experts, had fired thousands of rounds at paper targets, had achieved proficiency through standardized instruction. They were competent riflemen by any objective measure, capable of the marksmanship that military service required. But they had never learned to hunt, had never developed the observation skills and patience that came from tracking animals through forests, had never experienced the pressure of knowing that missing a shot meant their family would go hungry. Their skills were adequate for conventional combat but insufficient for counter-sniper operations that required capabilities training could not provide. This was the truth the 7 dead Japanese snipers testified to, that warfare, despite all its technological sophistication and tactical complexity, still rewarded ancient skills, still valued the hunter's patience and the marksman's discipline, still required capabilities that emerged from lived experience rather than institutional instruction. The American military could manufacture competent soldiers through training, could take civilians and transform them into riflemen in a matter of weeks. But it could not manufacture James Caldwell, could not replicate in training camps the education he received growing up poor in Kentucky, hunting to survive. The symbolic power of Caldwell's Springfield rifle, The object that represented his journey from mocked farm boy to respected Marine lay in its ordinariness. It was not a precision instrument crafted for an elite sniper, not a customized weapon with advanced optics and specialized ammunition. It was a standard-issue service rifle, the same model carried by thousands of Marines, distinguished from its fellows only by the skills of the man who used it. The rifle had not made Caldwell effective. Caldwell had made the rifle effective, had extracted from a mass-produced tool capabilities that exceeded its design specifications through expertise learned far from any military institution. This represented a particularly American form of military effectiveness, the ability to take ordinary citizens with diverse backgrounds and extract from them specialized capabilities, to recognize that a farm boy from Kentucky might possess skills an urban recruit lacked, that poverty and rural isolation might forge attributes valuable in combat, that democracy's strength lay partly in its diversity of experience. The Wehrmacht had trained elite snipers in specialized schools, had created cadres of expert marksmen through intensive instruction. The Imperial Japanese Army had cultivated sniper skills through cultural emphasis on individual excellence and patience. The Americans, characteristically, had done both, but had also simply looked through their ranks for men who already possessed the necessary skills, who had learned in civilian life what military training struggled to teach. James Caldwell was not exceptional by birth or by nature. He was a product of his environment, shaped by poverty and necessity, educated by a father who understood that survival required skills their society undervalued but still needed. What made him valuable in combat was not individual genius, but the accumulated knowledge of rural America, the unromantic expertise of men who hunted to eat and shot to kill cleanly, because anything else was cruelty and waste. That expertise, learned in Depression-era poverty and dismissed by urban sophisticates who confused accent with intelligence, proved decisive in jungle warfare where visibility measured in yards and patience measured in hours. The 7 Japanese snipers he killed had been specialists themselves, men selected and trained for roles that required exceptional skill and discipline, who had survived previous campaigns and proven their effectiveness against other American units. They were not novices or conscripts, but professionals who understood their craft, who had perfected the arts of camouflage and concealment, who should have been effectively impossible for an 18-year-old replacement to eliminate. That Caldwell killed them anyway testified not to their inadequacy, but to his preparation, to skills honed over years rather than weeks, to an education that began with his father's patient instruction and continued through a childhood spent hunting in terrain and conditions that prepared him perfectly for combat in Pacific jungles. The laughter that greeted Caldwell's claims of shooting accuracy at Camp Lejeune, the mockery of urban Marines who treated his rural background as a subject for jokes, represented a failure of imagination, an inability to recognize that expertise came in forms their own experiences had not equipped them to value. They knew marksmanship as taught on firing ranges, as measured by standardized qualifications. They did not know hunting, did not understand the difference between shooting at static targets and tracking living prey, between firing at known distances and calculating range by intuition, between competence developed through instruction and expertise forged through necessity. This distinction mattered. Military training could produce competent riflemen in weeks, but it could not produce hunters, could not replicate the education Caldwell received from his father, could not manufacture the patience and observation skills that came from years of practice motivated by survival rather than career advancement. The Marines who mocked Caldwell possessed skills their training had provided. Caldwell possessed skills training could not provide, capabilities that emerged from a life experience the military could recognize but never duplicate, that it could employ but not create. In this sense, the Springfield rifle hanging above a Kentucky fireplace represents more than one man's wartime service. It represents the hidden capabilities of rural America, the skills learned in poverty and obscurity, the expertise that went unrecognized until circumstances revealed its value. It represents fathers teaching sons, knowledge passed across generations, the accumulated wisdom of men who lived close to the land and understood violence not as abstraction, but as the ordinary reality of feeding a family. It represents democracy's hidden strength, that among its ordinary citizens existed extraordinary capabilities, that diversity of experience created diversity of skills, that the nation could draw upon a deep reservoir of expertise precisely because it had not standardized its population into uniformity. The 7 Japanese snipers lie in forgotten graves, casualties in a war that claimed millions, their individual deaths statistically insignificant in the vast ledger of combat. But they died to a truth their doctrine had not prepared them for, that American military effectiveness emerged not only from industrial capacity and technological advantage, but also from the diversity of its fighting force, from the unexpected capabilities of men like James Caldwell, who brought to war skills learned in peace, who applied to combat lessons taught for entirely different purposes, who demonstrated that the rifle in trained hands was less important than the training behind the hands holding the rifle. And so the Springfield remains, oiled and maintained, a functional weapon that will never fire again, a symbol of the 8 days when a farm boy from Kentucky proved that mockery was not judgment and that the skills learned in poverty could surpass the training provided by institutions. It hangs there still, above a fireplace in the Cumberland Mountains, a silent witness to the truth that James Caldwell's father understood and tried to teach his son, that patient observation and clean killing mattered more than speed or aggression, that understanding terrain and behavior predicted success better than confidence or bravado, that the hunt rewarded those who could wait and watch and shoot once, perfectly, because necessity taught lessons training never could. The rifle speaks to anyone who knows its history, tells a story of 7 Japanese snipers and the farm boy who killed them, of Marines who learned too late to respect what they had mocked, of a father's patient instruction validated in the worst imaginable classroom. It represents the inheritance of necessity, the expertise forged in poverty, the capabilities that emerged from hunger and survival, and the Depression-era reality that made hunting not recreation but essential labor, that made accuracy not a competition but the difference between a family that ate and a family that starved. This was James Caldwell's gift and burden, that the poverty he resented and the skills it forced him to develop saved his life and others' lives, that his childhood of hardship prepared him perfectly for 8 days of combat, that the mockery he endured at Camp Lejeune transformed into grudging respect on Bougainville. He never claimed to be a hero, never spoke of his kills with pride or satisfaction, understood that he had simply applied skills learned in one context to challenges presented in another. The Marines had needed a hunter and he had been one, and 7 Japanese snipers died because a Kentucky farm boy understood patience and observation and clean killing in ways his urban peers never could. The Springfield rifle remembers, as rifles do, measuring its memory not in emotions, but in the mechanical truth of actions performed and outcomes achieved. 7 shots, 7 kills, 8 days that transformed a mocked replacement into a respected Marine, a farm boy into a hunter of men, a rifle into a symbol of all the hidden capabilities rural America contributed to victory in the Pacific. The rifle hangs there still, above a Kentucky fireplace, waiting for hands that will never hold it again, for a war that ended decades ago, for the farm boy who proved that skill learned in poverty and passed from father to son could surpass training developed in institutions, that democracy's strength lay partly in its diversity, that ordinary citizens contained extraordinary capabilities, and that 7 Japanese snipers learned too late what James Caldwell's platoon learned in 8 days. That mockery was not judgment, that accuracy was not boasting, and that the farm boy from Kentucky could shoot exactly as well as he quietly claimed.